working interest plan talks about. One of the kind of interesting interests that he sees in conflict is this idea of political expediency versus accuracy. You know, governments oftentimes will promise large things to get the public and their colleagues to say yes. Right? They have to build political will. One of the things about the national government, right, particularly because it is so complex, because it's so hard to move it, you really have to make very big promises, often prompted by fairly significant kind of crises to make significant movements in the government. You know, they have to almost be forced to act on stuff. And you have to get an awful lot of people to agree. And what that causes, it causes a dynamic where politicians tend to overpromise, and in an effort to gain sufficient votes or to gain the support that they need, recognizing that some things can't fully be delivered, they tend to, kind of sweep it under the rug. Right? They promise stuff that they can't deliver, and they kind of acknowledge to each other that that's a fact, but they don't want to say it in public. Right? That's part of that is political expediency. But part of it is just the difficulty of getting to decisions. And there is some legitimacy in the idea of the ability to reach a compromise on principled issues. So you should be really skeptical when you look at a budget as to whether or not it really balances, and how you would define balance. And even whether the way that it was balanced in a way that in the long term is a responsible way of budgeting. There's this interesting kind of tension in particular around taxes and fees, right? We talked about a separation. We talked about taxes as being perceived as a burden. We talked about a separation between what you pay for in terms of government and what you get back in terms of government. And because of that, there are a bunch of constraints, oftentimes, on the ability to raise taxes. So sometimes the constraint is around making sure that the taxpayer at the current time is treated fairly and has a shot at getting the services that are most important to that individual. But there's also a generational idea in taxation, right? And in budgeting. The idea of balance, right? Balance of the budget and budget in a period of time raises issues that you're not supposed to burden future generations with tax obligations, right? So there's a bunch of equity issues you have to think of in raising money that are both equity in terms of those people that are currently in the discussion and the equity of future generations. And oftentimes the way that the definition of balance is described in equity issues in the context of those participants at the time, but it also is thought of in terms of generational equity. Are you burdening future generations with a burden to pay for the services that you received but didn't appropriately pay for? Anybody ever use one of these parking meters in the city of Chicago? Right? The ones where you got the app on the phone and you pull up and then you get a ticket if they don't pay it. That's like a really good example of this idea of budget balance, manipulation of the definition of budget balance, and budget equity. Around the time of the economic kind of meltdown, right? So we had the big problems around 2007, 2008. The mayor of Chicago at that time had a huge budget hole that he was manipulating. He was manipulating the definition of budget balance, right? He was essentially throwing money at the budget that he didn't have, or kind of one-time money, and it wasn't sufficient to sustain his rate of spending. But in the kind of very narrow kind of interpretation explanation of budget, his budget was balanced. He realized that he could start selling city assets and resources, and realized that one of the things that he could sell was he could sell the rights to run and set the rates on all the parking meters in the city of Chicago. And he entered into, I think it's like a 99-year deal, something like that, with a company, and gave away the right to set parking rates and to regulate parking meters. And then that isn't necessarily a bad thing to do, because the government did a crappy job of running parking meters. It was, they were lousy meters, and they didn't do a good job collecting revenue, so they weren't very good at the business. But he completely gave up his rights on into the future to set those parking fees and rates, and then he took virtually all of the money and spent it over the course of about 2.5 years, right? Because he didn't have a balanced budget. So he got rid of all the money. He essentially spent 100 years worth of money to balance a budget over a few years, and gave away the government's right to set the fees for those parking meters. You could have structured that transaction in a responsible sort of way. You could have taken that money and not spent it on operating. You could have reduced other kinds of debt. You could have set it aside and generated money over time. But the reality is what really was problematic for it is that it violated both a basic rule. It kind of masked a deficit, an imbalance. It then took all the money to create a artificial balance and gave the price tag for that imbalance to future generations. At the time, I think it passed unanimously. Every member of the city government, most members of the city council say, yeah, I'm all for it, let's go, you're a genius. Right. Why did he say he was a genius? He said, well, it's an economic downturn, the economy's going to come back, we don't want to burden local people with taxes, we're going to just take this, aren't we geniuses, the meters are going to be better, right? So a decision that in kind of the rear view mirror, most people think was, kind of deeply irresponsible, at the time was broadly supported. People didn't get mad about it and think something was wrong until after the budget was approved and these guys took over the parking meters, and suddenly everybody's parking rates doubled, right? So that's really a way of talking about when you think about taxes and fees and the ability to raise revenue, there are complicated issues that are both based on current constituents and where they feel, or what they feel about the taxes and the issues, but there's also generational equity that has to be considered, and the kind of reality of the moment, the need to decide controversial issues in a relatively short time frame or a 1-year operating period can sometimes skew the decision. And you have to be able to kind of step back and look at it and see whether the level of whether the decision was right, and two, whether the level of control was sufficient to guarantee the kind of outcome that was sought, policy outcome that was sought by protecting taxpayers. If this is about politics, it is about power. And power is about influence on the decision. And influence on the decision is often based on who gets to participate and the rules for consideration of the budget. Right? And the reality is the people that hold power, so those interests, whether that's a majority of the city council, whether that's the mayor, whether that's community groups that were influential in getting people put into power, the reality is most stuff is decided by a majority vote, not a consensus. Most of this stuff is decided through democratic actions of the executive and the legislative branch, less so in the courts. So most of this stuff gets determined by the majority. And the majority gets to do everything from make the decisions to influence the rules. And because those entities that are participating are elected representatives, particularly as you get like at state and local government where there's a much closer connection to the officials and the outputs of the government, right? It generally is reflective of community values and can be subject to change as a consequence of a change in community values. So for example, that same city council that approved that parking meter deal in a relatively short period of time and said they were geniuses, as soon as the public got mad, as soon as the public perception of what was valued changed, they imposed a bunch of requirements on the next deal. So something like this would never happen again, right? And it's impacted not just by the community values of the government that's making a decision for itself, it's impacted by community values of the other levels of government, right? I mean, we're here in the city of Chicago, but we're also here in the county of Cook. We're also here in the state of Illinois. We're also here in the United States, right? Each one of those governments has its own different defined constituency that has some overlap, right? But it also has, as you move beyond the city of Chicago, it also has new constituents that have new and different values. Right? So some people in the state of Illinois don't think so highly of the city of Chicago. Right? Or have different kinds of priorities and values. So last year, when the state finally got the consensus to pass the budget, one of the things that the state decided to do is some of the money that it generally gave to local governments, it wouldn't give them so much of it. Right? So when they raised taxes, they said, local governments, we're not going to give you your share of those taxes, right? And for the taxes that we collect on your behalf, like sales tax, we're going to charge you more to do those, right? So the values of other levels of government can impact everything from the resources you have to the discretion and the ability to make decisions. And usually those values of different community values at different kind of levels of community or jurisdiction results in mandates and limitations on authority. Right? They tell you you must do something or you can't do something. Right? Anybody been paying attention to this idea of sanctuary cities, part of the immigration debate? Anybody watch that? Anybody know what it is? Right, so there's a part of the kind of national immigration debate, cities and states that are more open to not penalizing illegal immigration, or that think the national government's rules are too harsh, pass their own kind of requirements that make it easier for illegal immigrants to live in their cities. Right? And when the new administration came in, President Trump, who's so negative on immigration, decided that he was going to crack down on sanctuary cities like the city of Chicago and make a real stand, and instructed his attorney general to threaten to withhold grants of all different kinds from the federal government because of their ability or their willingness to adopt immigration, policies and stance that run counter to the national government, right? That is the same, right? It's the same country, but a different jurisdictional boundary, a different set of community values tied to the people in power can significantly impact the flow and availability of resources, right? That's a good example of the kind of open